Welcome back to Face the Nation. The total number of COVID-19 cases worldwide now stands at 8.8 million, and the World Health Organization warns that the pandemic is accelerating, particularly in the Americas. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer reports from London. Liz?
Margaret, here in Europe, things have really turned around. Coronavirus, at least for now, is in retreat. Borders are even reopening so people can travel to vacation spots. But in the developing world, the pandemic is raging. Brazil is in full-blown crisis. As in the U.S., COVID-19 here has become political. On Copacabana Beach, a pandemic denier knocked down crosses at a symbolic memorial. But arguing can't hide the facts. 50,000 new cases a day here, and the coronavirus peak is still weeks away. Nearby in Peru, they're selling oxygen in the streets. The infection rate has come down a little, but left many families treating COVID victims at home because hospitals are too full or too expensive. This is still a dangerous time, warned WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus.
Many people are understandably fed up with being at home. Countries are understandably eager to open up their societies and economies. But the virus is still spreading fast.
In India's capital, Delhi, they learned that the hard way. Shops, offices, and markets reopened 2 weeks ago, and the virus took off. Now, with hospitals overwhelmed, the city is converting train carriages into makeshift COVID wards. They'll offer a bed of sorts and oxygen, but not a chance of social distancing. Russia, too, lifted its strict lockdown and even staged rehearsals for the traditional Victory Day parade. Lots of hardware, very few masks. The Kremlin insists, in spite of widespread skepticism, that the virus is under control, but then announced that anyone meeting President Putin will first have to go through one of these disinfection machines. And in St. Petersburg, a makeshift memorial put faces to the names of the almost 500 doctors and nurses who have died fighting coronavirus. Here in the UK, the government is hinting that it's about to relax the social distancing rule from 6 feet to 3. The hope is it will help hotels and restaurants, if not thrive, at least survive. Margaret?
Liz Palmer, thank you. We turn now to former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who's in Westport, Connecticut this morning. Good morning to you, Dr. Gottlieb.
Good morning.
We heard that the number of COVID-19 cases has exceeded 30,000 a day for the first time in about 7 weeks. What is happening?
Well, we're seeing a resurgence in the South and the Southeast. They never really got rid of their epidemics. Now we're seeing significant outbreaks on top of a background rate of spread that was quite high. As they reopened, that spread has continued to increase. And so, you know, a challenge that was facing some regions of the country now is facing every region in the country. And the worry is that they're going to tip over into exponential growth coming this week because the cases are building quite quickly in Texas, Florida, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Arizona. And the challenge with exponential growth is everything looks okay until suddenly it doesn't. And so this is something that has to be a concern of everyone that's been watching this.
When you say exponential growth, are you saying that hospitals are about to get overwhelmed in places like Arizona and Texas?
That's the concern. So if you look at places like Arizona, the hospitals now are getting pressed. Midweek, there was a report out of Arizona that about 40% of the hospital beds were filled with COVID patients. Texas and Florida still are reporting a lot of capacity, even though Florida doesn't report the total hospitalizations for COVID patients. But these things can mount very quickly, as we saw in New York. You're always, when the epidemic's expanding, it's always worse than what you're measuring. And so there are a lot more cases in these states that are going to get turned over this coming week, given the rate of growth that we've seen. We know that there's community spread now underway in states like Florida, Texas, California, for that matter, too, and Arizona. Those are big states that have a lot of cases that have been building. And so this is going to be hard to get under control. We're not going to want to shut down businesses again. We're not going to want to shut down the economy. So there's not many tools we can reach for. We can do case-based interventions, the tracking and the tracing of sick people to get people isolated. We can go towards universal masking, something that's been controversial in some of these states. But there's not much else you can do. And so there's no quick intervention that's going to bring this to an end.
In Arizona, it was just this week that the governor gave mayors the power to make masks mandatory. They're not doing that in Florida. They're not doing that in Texas. Is that a mistake?
Well, I think they're going to have to. I think it's a mistake that they're not doing it now. They're losing precious time. I think they're going to have to. The masking has become controversial. It shouldn't be. It's a simple intervention. It's a collective action we can all take to help protect our fellow citizens and also protect ourselves and try to reopen the economy safely. I think some people see it as a sort of infringement on their liberty or as a way to cast some scorn on a public health establishment that's come in for some questions because people blame the public health establishment for the shutdowns. They blame the public health establishment for some conflicting guidance. I think in other quarters, it's been portrayed as something that, Trump supporters don't want to wear masks. It's neither of those things. It's something that we can do collectively to try to reduce the spread. It's really all we have, and it's not a very robust tool at that, but it's a tool that we have, and it's a tool that's been demonstrated to have an impact if everyone does it or if most people do it.
Well, health officials did give conflicting messages on wearing masks in the first place, but we now know from Dr. Fauci it's because they were afraid of shortages.
And also worried that by telling people they can wear masks, you're telling them they can go out. So at a time that they were telling people to stay at home, there was concern that telling them that if they wear masks, they're more safe, will encourage people to go out. And so I think that could have been messaged appropriately. They didn't need to be concerned about that. We should have been recommending masks from the outset.
We heard from the Secretary of Homeland Security earlier in the program, and he said the press and others only want to talk and focus on the increased case count, and that testing's a good message. The president says testing's overrated. What is the bottom line, the science and the facts about where we are with this virus in America right now?
Well, testing, there's a high correlation between places that are doing more testing, more contact tracing, and have decreased mobility and have a better picture right now. Some of the cases that we're collecting are because we're testing more, but the positivity rate's also going up in states like Texas, where it's about 8%, Florida about 8%, Arizona almost 20%. We're seeing the positivity rates go up. That's a clear indication that there's now community spread underway, and this isn't just a function of testing more. So some of it is testing more. We're probably capturing right now somewhere between 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 infections. Before, during the epidemic, we were probably measuring 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 infections. So we're capturing a higher percentage of the overall infections, but the infections are also going up. So this is an epidemic that's expanding in these states. And the challenge is there's not a clear endpoint. We're becoming more and more dependent upon a therapeutic intervention early in the fall to be our backstop because we're taking a lot of virus through this summer. We really shouldn't be where we are in June right now. It's not clear what's going to improve the picture in July and August if we're not going to start to impose additional mitigation, start closing bars and restaurants. And states aren't going to want to do that. They're going to be slow to do that. And so these case counts are going to build.
And many of these states we're talking about are not doing those things you're recommending. I want to ask you, though, about what some of the businesses are doing, because it was businesses who kind of led the way in shutting down in the first place. Apple shuttered stores in Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina due to outbreaks. Every team in Major League Baseball is going to shut their camps due to this. Are corporations going to have to lead the way this time as well? Is it on the business owner to shut it down, in other words? Is the restaurant owner responsible for making that decision and not the state, not the mayor?
That's what happened last time. The states and local school districts really forced the hand of policymakers on shutting down the economy. I think what you're going to see is businesses that are national in scope are going to close stores regionally. And that's what we saw with Apple. We saw with another business today in Florida. I think school districts right now are contemplating how they reopen, and some of them might make decisions not to reopen looking at all these trends in these states. It's going to be harder for them to lock into plans. I think they should try to reopen in the fall, but if there's a lot of virus still in July and August, it's going to be very hard for them to reopen these schools. So if we want to reopen the schools, we've got to get this under control. We might have to take a little bit of economic pain right now to get this under better control in these states to open up the opportunity to open schools in the fall, which is going to have a big economic benefit because parents can't go back to work in earnest unless their kids are in school.
Absolutely. Good point. Thank you very much, Dr. Gottlieb. Always good to talk to you. Be right back. We want to go now to the island of Kauai in Hawaii, where CEO Jide Zeitlin is this morning. He's the head of a Fortune 500 company called Tapestry Incorporated. You know them as the parent company of luxury fashion brands Coach, Kate Spade, and Stuart Weitzman. Good morning.
Good morning, Margaret.
This week we saw from the Commerce Department this announcement that consumers were spending in May. Retail sales numbers were better than expected. I'm wondering what you think is happening with consumers right now.
What we see, and we see this around our global business, is that consumers have remained engaged. Even during a period where all of our brick and mortar stores were closed, they were very engaged digitally with our brands, with our products. And now as they have the opportunity to engage in a physical way, we see them doing so and doing so enthusiastically. Although it's a slow step-by-step process. So it's not just a return to where things were, but the opportunity to engage physically and digitally is something that we see consumers being enthusiastic to do.
And you're reopening a number of your businesses, not just in this country, but also in China, which continues to see these flare-ups of COVID-19. I wonder how you're dealing with that sort of start-stop, flare-up, pullback. Do you go ahead and rehire people to actually work in stores, or are those jobs going to come back at all?
Well, we held on longer than most of our peers, and so we did not furlough or lay off employees for quite some time globally, and particularly here in North America. But what we have seen is that we went from fully shut in Asia to today in China being fully opened, in South Korea being fully open, and that has stayed steady. At the same time, in North America, we're gradually opening, but really taking the lead from our store employees, from our consumers, so that we look to avoid both start and stop, but also want to make sure we do it in a way that makes the most sense for our employees.
But the jobs are coming back. You think it's not all going to be online shopping from here on out?
Without a doubt, Margaret, at least in our case, we think the consumer is really moving towards a balance, a blend between digital and physical.
Now, we talked about you being the head of one of the Fortune 500 companies, one of the largest corporations in the world, that means. And you are one of only 4 African Americans in that list. There are 0 Black women on that list among the 37 female leaders. And I wonder what you think the reason is. Why at the highest levels is diversity still a challenge?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality, and it's a real opportunity. And it's an opportunity really for boards and for management to challenge themselves, to really challenge themselves in terms of both diversity and inclusivity. So you focused in terms of statistics on diversity, and it's clear that we need to better recognize that it's not simply a nice thing, it's a real business imperative to have a diverse number of views around the table. The more you have different life perspectives, different experiences around the table, we develop better products, we develop better solutions as corporations, and it's one of America's great strengths if we get it right. So it's really holding ourselves much more accountable, the same way we hold ourselves accountable for revenue and profit targets, to make sure that we are diverse, and then to meet that diversity with a really inclusive environment, one that encourages people to show up fully at work as themselves.
But how does corporations are having to make these decisions on their own? What's the best way to do these things? Is it setting quotas? Is it hiring headhunters and talent scouts to bring in people from the inside? I mean, how do you put this into practice?
It's holding ourselves accountable for goals in the same way we hold ourselves accountable for revenue and profit metrics. And it is fundamentally believing that this is a business imperative. You know, I noted last week that you had Rob Kaplan on your show, and he made the comment representing the Federal Reserve, the belief that inclusivity translates into greater workforce growth, greater productivity growth, and greater economic growth. And so if we exist within an ecosystem, within an economic ecosystem, the faster that ecosystem is growing because it is more diverse and inclusive, the faster we will grow. So it's a real imperative, and we need to hold ourselves accountable the same way we do against other business metrics.
But when you say business metrics, that means setting quotas? Because I read that you had said diversity by itself doesn't mean a lot until you change the culture of your organization. Those seem like two different things.
They are two different things. So it is goals, as I think about it. So being very clear that our workforce ought to look like the American demographic, and is not setting goals that are 5 or 10 years out. It's setting goals that are quite immediate. In the same way as my board holds me accountable for revenue and profit metrics, not 5 and 10 years out, but this year and next year. That is the diversity piece of it. And then on the inclusivity piece, it's recognizing that if you don't change your culture so that if a more diverse workforce comes and they find themselves living in a 1950s culture and in a culture that is not representative of where America is today, you won't keep your people, you won't motivate your people, you won't get the best out of your people. So it's having a culture or being more inclusive that actually encourages people to fully show up as themselves.
All right. Jide, thank you very much for your time and your reflections.
Thank you, Margaret.
We'll be back in a moment. Americans across the country honored Juneteenth as a day of reflection and, in some cases, celebration this past Friday. It is meant to commemorate June 19th, 1865, the day slaves in Galveston, Texas learned they were free and the Civil War was over. Some states and U.S. corporations have newly designated it a paid holiday. New York Times columnist and CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie joins us from Charlottesville, Virginia this morning to give us some more context. Good morning.
Good morning.
You know, many Americans are really learning about the historical significance of Juneteenth for the first time, and you reflected on it in a column this week. But you say you don't think of it as slaves having been granted freedom, but rather seizing it for themselves. What do you mean by that?
The story of emancipation, going really back to the founding of the country, all the way to the Civil War, is very much the story of enslaved Africans and freed blacks taking the initiative to put their freedom on the agenda of national politics. And that's especially true during the Civil War. The war, as many people know, does not begin as a war for abolition. It begins as a war for union. But as soon as the shooting starts, enslaved people are escaping to Union lines. They're leaving work on plantations. They're offering their assistance to Union soldiers as guides, as laborers, and eventually as soldiers. And it's those actions that transform the war for Union into a war for liberation, into a war for emancipation. And although Juneteenth commemorates those enslaved Africans who were whisked away to Texas to avoid the Emancipation Proclamation, I think it's still an opportunity for us to really think and take seriously the fact that emancipation does not happen without the actions of the enslaved, not just over the war, but really over the course of 80 years.
And you're finding some resonance in that in the moment we're in today?
That's right. I think why Juneteenth has sort of erupted in this way over the past couple weeks, why people find it so resonant right now, is that Juneteenth is very much a holiday about the distance between freedom that is promised and freedom that is lived. And right now, millions of Americans are seeing, with regards to police brutality, with regards to inequality, the distance that still exists between freedom and liberty as we imagine it, as we have proclaimed it, and that as it's actually experienced by ordinary people.
Texas Senator John Cornyn and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee are talking about trying to make it a federal holiday. You have a lot of corporations acknowledging it, some giving the day off as well now. But you kind of said that doesn't sit quite right with you. You see it as a little bit opportunistic.
Right. It's no one's going to complain about a paid holiday, right? Like everyone likes paid holidays. But when we think about what protesters are calling for, when we think about what actualizing freedom actually means, I happen to think that a more fitting tribute to Juneteenth would be policies that assist not just African Americans, but every American to help them reach their full potential, help them, again, actualize their freedom in a real way. That, to me, is what the holiday is about. It's about that distance and what we can do to close that distance.
You're speaking to us from Charlottesville, Virginia. And I don't have to tell you, but to remind our audience, that was the location in 2017 for what became a fatal white supremacist rally. And it was sparked originally by the statue of Robert E. Lee and the debate over whether to remove that symbol of the Confederacy. Fast forward to today. I mean, this week we had the governor of Virginia talk about taking down Lee in the capital of the Confederacy. Isn't that progress?
Right. I think that's progress. I think that represents Americans coming to recognize what those statues were erected for. They weren't erected as memorials after the war. They are very much erected as symbols of Jim Crow, as symbols of white supremacy. And I think it's the public beginning to come to the recognition that public space is ours to shape, right? That when we put up memorials or monuments, we are trying to present a particular memory of the past that we want to remember. And do we want to remember, honor a past where someone like Robert E. Lee was a central figure, a figure of esteem? I don't think we do. I don't think millions of Americans want to. And so that is, I think, what we're seeing, and it does constitute progress.
Jamelle, thank you. We'll be right back. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton is the subject of considerable criticism from the Trump White House in light of his new book. Yesterday, President Trump said he'd been upset with Bolton since the beginning, starting with an appearance right here on Face the Nation more than 2 years ago. Let's listen.
He was being interviewed on To Face the Nation, one of your friendly shows, and he talked about the Libyan model on Kim Jong-un, who I have a very good relationship with and had a very good relationship with. Once he mentioned that, it was not a good situation. I said, how stupid can you be? Because you know what happened to Gaddafi. Nobody wants to die the way he died. And here's a guy saying, we like the Libyan model. And all I could do is hope that they didn't see it, but they did see it. It was one of the dumbest things I've ever seen on television, frankly. So he lost me.
Of course, we call our broadcast Face the Nation. And we will be talking to John Bolton again in 2 weeks on July 5th. But that is going to do it for us today. We want to wish all of the dads out there watching a happy Father's Day. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.